Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on disruption. To many of us, the immediate disruptions that concern us are disruptions caused by VIP movement and traffic, or fog and plane landings. But this one, I think, promises to be one of more far-reaching consequence, the digital disruptions which we all see and face. Many of us were not really core techies. One wonders what this is all about. Look around a bit and then suddenly it strikes you and think back, maybe a decade, and you see what changes have come in your life, it says, in these past few years. You heard this morning mention of driverless cars from first Rajan and then Satya Nadella, and yet on the horizon, but that's the kind of thing we begin to see that new digital technologies will give rise to. Of course, I should remind us that in many ways, driverless cars were invented in India long before Google did. And this was not 5,000 years ago, like many other things we invented, but this is more recent. And some of you would recall a case in Mumbai where a rather famous person was alleged to have caused an accident, and final conclusion was there was no driver. So, we had driverless cars much earlier. Some of you would remember what that case was about. But that's one kind of thing. The other one, and much talked about cliche, but so true, that today the biggest hospitality company owns no rooms, Airbnb. The biggest retailer owns no shops, that's Amazon. And of course, you heard a little bit of that, of the Indian version of it. The biggest transportation company with the higher value market capitalization than transportation makers is Uber. So you begin to see how digital is transforming everything we do and becoming something which we all are consumers on. So world of tomorrow, which has been often called the shared economy, is not really so much the shared economy as an everything as a service economy, where everything you can need will come as a service. Many, many changes that we begin to see as we go in this direction of digital. And this session today has three very eminent, very knowledgeable panelists here. I don't want to take more time introducing the topic. We're going to start straight away. We're trying to make this conversational, so the format is that we'll speak briefly and then have a little questions from those of you who have questions and try and get in as many of those as possible, and then just wind up the session, hopefully in good time. I want to start first, and all of you know the panelists here. I'm sorry we walked in a bit late, but I presume they were introduced. If not, let me just go through it very quickly on the assumption that they haven't. Mr. Chandrashekhar, President NASSCOM, Mr. C.P. Gurnani, CEO of Tech Mahindra, and Srini Rajan, CEO and Chairman of Bain, India. So, C.P., let me start with you. Tell us in just terms that you see, which a common man, a non-techie like me would relate to, what is this digital disruption? How is it changing our lives?
I mean, a topic which has been more discussed than probably the Indian economy. So, I don't know from where to start, but I can only tell you that this Diwali I was with my daughter in San Francisco. And I started, reacting to the way she lives. Today, she gets up in the morning, she's talking to Alexa. Alexa, switch on this light. Alexa, read me the news of the day. Alexa, what is the temperature and weather? And I couldn't stop but reflect that the same girl growing up was newspapers. Newspapers became internet. Internet became an app, and app has now become a voice-activated. Now, everything that I have spoken up till now was always digital. It's just a question now is the rate of change in an individual's life. If the individual's life, digital is becoming so integral, I'm sure it is becoming part of the work life. And if it is becoming part of the work life, it is also a part of the society, and it is part of the government. So in my opinion, whether we call it Industry 4.0 when we go into manufacturing, or whether we call it version 5.0 when we go into a new piece of software that your company is releasing, the reality is that everything that is happening around us can be redefined by digital. And for us, at least in Tech Mahindra, we believe that this rate of change of technology is also the opportunity. For most of us, it really means is we can be more productive, we can be more efficient. For most of us, it also means we can have different careers. So I believe the word digital disruption is wrong. I think digital opportunities is more appropriate.
We'll come back to that, CP. I think a good point in terms of relating to life. But I'm a bit worried with the example you gave. You know, we may not need human beings any longer, but we'll come back to that point too. But I want...
Kiran is already missing his Ramu.
I was going to say, instead of telling Alexa, you say, Ramu, get me the tea here. Anyway, Shekhar, let me ask you to step back a little bit and say, you know, what are these digital disruptors? What's new? You know, digital technology has been around for a while. So what's really new and what's causing this change which is making life, as CP just defined, and companies look differently?
I think the sheer power of the new technologies and the kind of changes that they're bringing in and the way it has sort of permeated every aspect of our lives has led to a lot of profound changes in the way things are done. And I think that this is changing many things, not just the way we work and entertain ourselves or do anything. We just heard a snapshot from CP, and the time it takes for those changes to happen in India vis-a-vis what happens in developed countries has also completely shrunk. It's almost happening more or less simultaneously. So we are no longer insulated in terms of even time from the changes that are happening. And this has a tremendous impact on the kind of jobs that people do, the kind of prospects that people have, the kind of skills that they need, and you know, the way that, for example, manufacturing has changed because of these technologies. Not only is everything automated, everything is connected, and if you look at Industry 4.0, it's not just everything within the factory being connected, it's also connected to suppliers outside, it's connected to customers outside, it's not just till the sale, it's even after the sale, everything is connected. For example, earlier, you know, people used to wonder what their drivers were doing when they were in the office. And now my wife asked the driver, oh, you went away somewhere while I was inside. It's all because, you know, the tracking is available and you know the moment your car has moved. All of these have, you know, started coming in. The joke is that the factory of the future would have only two employees, a dog and a human being. And the job of the human being is to feed the dog. And the job of the dog is to make sure that the human being doesn't touch any of the machinery. Now, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but the reality is that we already see plants which have $1 billion production and which have a single-digit number of employees.
So, Shekhar, what does this mean for jobs? Are we going to be all only leisure or doing nothing or being replaced by robots, or what's going to happen?
Well, you know, there are two levels to that question. The first is that I think that as a country, we do face a daunting challenge. So let me talk about the challenge a little bit before I come to the silver lining. 1.34 billion people, 860 million below the age of 35, a workforce of, you know, 460 million, and that's also largely because, you know, we don't have enough of women's participation in the workforce. We have 1 million people entering the workforce every month, and we have less than 2 million jobs getting created every year. So is this a demographic dividend, or is this a ticking demographic time bomb? That's the question. And if you look at manufacturing, I've already given you some you know, sense of what is all of us know is happening and how many jobs that will yield. We already know that China is at the, you know, has really become the factory of the world. It's not going to be easy to knock them off their perch even fractionally. And at the same time, even if we did succeed, it's not going to create the kind of jobs. So from a jobs perspective, that success is not very relevant. If you look at the service industry, there also it's quite profoundly impacted. If you look at the IT industry, it's not only the cause of a lot of the disruption, it is itself getting disrupted as much. And we had, in fact, got a study done. In fact, FICCI and NASSCOM, with the help of Ernst & Young, had got a study done to look at, what is likely to happen to jobs in India. Because as many of you would know, in the Davos meeting of the WEF earlier this year in January, the focus was entirely on jobs. And there was a lot of concern in developed countries about, how the shrinkage of jobs and the disappearance of some of the jobs, especially the white-collar jobs, was causing a problem. The emergence of so-called new-collar jobs was not solving the problem because the new-collar jobs required skills which people didn't have, and they were in smaller number, required higher skills. All of this is happening in India as well. And if you look at areas like even textiles, you look at financial services and banking, the effects are tremendously, widespread and substantial in terms of their impact even in India. About 10%, according to that study, about 10% of people by 2022, that's just 5 years from now, and we are talking about only India. By 2022, about 10% of the people will be doing jobs which don't exist today. And I'm talking about this sampling of 5 areas. A shade under 40% will be doing jobs which exist today, but which will be substantially different from what they are doing today. And just around 50% will be doing jobs which are similar to what the job is today, and which are similar in terms of skills.
Shekhar, let's come back to that. I think it's an important point in terms of what we need to do. But I want to go to Sri for a moment and request you to give us a little perspective from the global scenario. What's happening in the whole area of changes in the digital space, and what does it mean for jobs? Not so much in the tech sector, but what implication does it have in manufacturing, in services, maybe even in agriculture? What's the scenario as you see it, and where would things be in India?
Sure. So, the work that we do for our clients globally, I'll give you a little bit of a perspective on what we are seeing. So there's clearly a big implication in terms of the way consumers are interacting with, let's say, retail opportunities, retail outlets. Clearly there's a big transition from offline to online. There is now the emergence of omni-channel where people actually interact both offline and online as well. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that the consumer experience requires a lot of technology in the back end to make it happen. So for you to have an interaction, for you to have an experience, either in an online channel or in an offline channel, that seamless experience that you have happens because of the investment that takes place in technology at the back end. What is happening, or what has happened over the course of the last few years that's fundamentally different from what's happened before that is because of the computing power that's come to the fore, and also because of the technologies that are now possible that make a lot more things possible in the back end. So the one takeaway that I want to make sure that people understand is that this is something that's actually bigger than just the consumer experience part of it. And it's changing fundamentally ways companies think about processes within their organization, which obviously, you would assume. So things like supply chain, production systems, and so on are changing very, very differently. But the way they think about these processes is also very different. The way they think about employee engagement within the organization is also changing. So people talk a lot about putting sensors in manufacturing environments, or in manufacturing floors, or on trucks, in supply chains, and so on. But there's a lot of work going on in terms of also putting in sensors at the employee level. And I don't mean in terms of, attaching a sensor to a human being, but in terms of understanding what is it that really drives productivity at the labor level. What is it that one can do to improve that? How do you actually drive causality of performance versus other attributes? There's a lot of interesting work that's going on over there. But I'll give you a few sort of things to just make you think about, what's really happening in the back end. And then I'll come and talk a little bit about what's happening maybe in India and also the impact it's having on jobs and so on. One example is that in retail stores today, in the US, not yet in India, but in retail stores today in the US, when you go into a fitting room to try out some clothes, and let's say, for example, you walked in with 5 and you decided to buy 1. Now, typically, that's just data that's lying over there. But today, with tags that are attached to every piece of clothing in a retail outlet, the retail outlet now figures out that you took these 5 pieces of, well, whatever, pants or shirts or whatever it might be, into the fitting room, and then tries to figure out why is it that you didn't buy those other 4. It also tries to figure out, therefore, what the optimal stocking level should be. So this is fundamentally changing the way retail outlets are thinking about how they should think about the customer experience, but more importantly, how it drives their own working capital and productivity. Another very simple, but actually a very powerful example is that in one grocery chain, through analysis of receipts of what customers were buying, they moved the juice boxes from the juice aisle to the aisle that was selling snacks, because that was the highest correlation in terms of how people were buying things. And sales of juice boxes went up by 80%. It makes a fundamental difference to the way you think about business. It makes a fundamental difference to the way you think about customer experience. And so I want to leave that with you. In terms of what's happening in India, based on our experience of working with clients, digitization or digitalization, whatever term you use, is now on the agenda of boards everywhere in the world, including in India. The difference, I will say, based on our experience of, let's say, contrasting our experience, let's say, in other parts of the world and in India, is that we are at the early stages of what we would expect people to do in terms of digitization. There are a lot of sensors that are being put in place on the factory floor, in supply chains. People are thinking about customer experience. How do we improve it? But I would say that we're at the very early stages. The one thing I will say is that companies are falling short, especially in India, is they're not investing in sensitizing their people to the changes that are about to happen. And I think it's very important for organizations from top to bottom to understand that there are big changes that are coming, and also to include them in terms of what could happen and what should happen. So let me pause over there.
Yeah, Sri, I think both you and Shekhar in a different way made a similar point about the changes that people in organizations, employees, and therefore managers, leaders would have to take in terms of what they need by way of skills. But I want to just spend a moment on something else. You know, hearing the three of you, frankly, it frightens me a bit. I don't know about the others in the audience. You know, CP started with something very interesting, but it made me think whether the significant other in many lives of younger people at least is going to be Alexa, or is it going to be a human being? Whom are they going to talk to and ask stuff? And Shekhar painted the picture of, you know, automation, all very nice, exciting, but he ended with saying the boss and the dog, no other jobs. So what's going to happen with all these people coming out? And you talked about sensors and what the exciting things that are happening certainly in the retail world, but reminds me too much of Big Brother, and I'm wondering whether 1984 is here a bit late or whether it's here, you know, in a much more advanced form. So CP, I know you're an optimist in this whole scenario of digital disruption and saying that, yeah, there are these concerns, but things are, you know, overall the opportunities and the possibilities are much more. You want to spend a few minutes talking about what those are and how this can be exciting and good and not all negative?
So Kiran, all of us agree that the rate of change has increased dramatically. All of us also know that the data that we get now in 1 month is more than what we got in the previous 500 months. And I have this question in practically in every all-hands meeting at Tech Mahindra, that are our jobs secure and will we be relevant in 2020 or in 2022? And I challenged some of my young millennial engineers, and I said, why don't you do a simple scan of the jobs that have remained open for more than 6 months in technology sector? They came back with a report which said that about 220 jobs have remained open in Silicon Valley for more than 6 months. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that if we are willing to change, if we want to be relevant, then there are opportunities there. Now look back. Many of you who have grown up in the last 30, 35 years have noticed that our children, our cousins are now doing jobs that we had not even heard of 35 years ago. I mean, we didn't even know that there were words like flexipreneurs. I mean, I had a young girl who is a chef and used to be a software engineer. Now she has decided that she is going to work on flexible hours and she's going to be an entrepreneur. She basically hates the idea of making the same butter chicken every day. She wants to experiment with butter chicken, and she's got people, thanks to the technology, that she is able to work flexibly and work in whatever work she wants to do. I mean, I can go into design, I can go into healthcare, I can go into a physical trainer, I can go into any number of jobs which are non-technical also. But my point is that technology is bringing all of them together. Technology is allowing them to work together. We looked at the startup, the scene in India. I mean, clearly that, you know, Ola Bhavesh coming here and talking about what he has been able to achieve with technology, whether it's an A.R. Rahman song or whether it is personalized to the driver, it clearly indicates is that there is a lot more possibilities if we just allow our imagination to expand, and digital and technology is giving you more and more opportunities. I am convinced that we can make an impact not only in India, but we can make an impact all over the world as long as we remember the world is more connected, the world is more boundaryless, and the world is allowing us to experiment. We don't have to join Rourkela steel plant and make that as our career.
So Shekhar, what are the careers of the future, and what is it that you see happening? How do people stay relevant? How do they stay, well, if not employed, how do they stay busy and earn a living?
No, somewhere I got a sneaky feeling in the first part when you referred to CP as an optimist that you were putting me in a different bucket. Let me assure you that while I am an optimist, I'm not a blind optimist. So I prefer to figure out what's happening and then look at that. So the point I was making is that, while all this is happening, there are new kinds of jobs coming up. There are new kinds of skills which make the current jobs also an opportunity for many young people. And, just within the IT industry, we had looked at what are some of the new technology areas, what are some of the new jobs which are coming up, which may not have existed, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. And we identified 8 technology areas, areas like data analytics, IoT, artificial intelligence, robotics, so things like that. And 55 job roles which map onto these 8 technologies. So that gives you a sense of people who are in the industry today, which are the kind of skills which they need to be acquiring to stay relevant and to get the new kind of jobs which are coming up. So I do believe that while manufacturing is getting automated in a way that is actually reducing the number of jobs, in the services sector there are new kinds of jobs coming up. Of course, there is a debate today about whether for the first time in the history of technology, whether technology is actually destroying more jobs than it is creating. That debate will go on for some time, I'm sure. But there's no doubt that new kinds of jobs are getting created. Let's take just one example by way of illustration. If you look at the Indian economy, it's a well-known thing that a large percentage, the majority of our population lives in rural areas, and we are still, at the end of the day, largely an agricultural economy. And it's also known that our productivity is very low, that our wastage is very high, and the growth in productivity is extremely low. And many of these technologies are looked at as some fancy technologies which happen in one part of the economy, and this has nothing to do with the real India or with Bharat. But the fact is that the potential of applying these technologies in a sector like agriculture, for example, using drone technology, using IoT ensuring, optimization of inputs, ensuring minimization of loss in the farm to table chain. All of these are areas where these technologies have tremendous potential, and they will add to rural incomes, rural wealth, all of which will fuel the economy. The thing, however, is that it's not going to happen automatically. Just the fact that these technologies are there and they have a relevance doesn't mean that they will get applied. What's missing is the innovation, both from a business point of view as well as from a technology point of view, which looks at the technology, tweaks it, looks at the business models, applies it, and creates services which provide this. So, for example, in some of even the developed countries, one of the big jobs is drone operator. Imagine if you're using drones pervasively in the agriculture sector, you're going to need a lot of such people. If you're using IoT in looking at optimization of inputs, then the kind of data which is generated and how you relate it to all of the things that I talked about will create a new set of jobs. So all of these are areas where we should be looking at these areas and looking at how we create on one side the entrepreneurs and the businesses which lead to services which apply these technologies, and what are the jobs which are getting created.
I'm glad you mentioned innovation, Shekhar, because I had a question on that, and I was, want to throw that to Sri. CP also mentioned entrepreneurship and startups. So Sri, with innovation being a key driver for the future, things are going to continuously change and innovate. You've looked at organizations in India and around the world. What is it that organizations need to do to ensure such innovation? Because unless organizations innovate, they'll become dinosaurs. They're all going to be dead as dodos soon. That's my feeling at least. So what is happening and what needs to be done to make sure that organizations encourage, nurture innovation, are able to get innovation driven forward as they go along? Are there special things that have been done elsewhere? What can we do in India? What do you see on the scene there?
I think it's a great question, Kiran. So let me try and answer that in as succinctly as possible. In my mind, in my experience, sometimes what organizations do is they create a separate innovation lab, so to speak, that becomes an incubator for new ideas. And I think that can help, especially something that's very disruptive, where it changes the business model for what you're doing. You really want somebody that's outside the current organization to think about it and not worry about either cannibalizing the existing organization or in terms of revenues or anything like that. And I think that can work. In my mind, that is really disruptive innovation. I think there's a lot to be said also about incremental innovation. And what I mean by that is that, how can you actually how can you do a lot better with what you already have? How can you improve the existing business model in fundamental ways? Like I talked about earlier, either supply chain, manufacturing, the consumer experience, whatever it might be. And for that, I think it's very important to change the culture of the organization. And I talked about this earlier, making sure from top to bottom that people really understand what is expected of them from the way things are evolving, from the way things are changing. I would say that this whole transformation or this whole movement towards digitization of industries and organizations cannot happen, with just a small group of people sitting in an organization and thinking about great ideas. You actually need people on the shop floor, you need people in the production teams, you need people in the, with supply chain, whatever it might be, to really get together and think about what is it that they need to do to fundamentally change the way they're working. That change has to come from within. And I would say the investment in people is fundamental to all this happening. And I'll say this, I'll make a generalization, but I think with most generalizations, this may be more true than less true, which is that investment is not happening today. That organizations are not making this investment to teach the skill set that is required for the future. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, but what you said, and to some extent, I'll come back to Shekhar. I know he didn't mean it that way, but this worries me a little bit about skills being now taught and newer skills that are emerging. Because the more we get into this, and this is a question I want to get to CP in a moment on, when you talk of innovation, it's thinking out of the box. When you talk of skills, you talk of things like the IT industry, we're all working on quality, which means the same process done the same way with no mistakes, properly done. You train people like that, and you recruit people like that, and you train them to be like that. And I must spend a moment to give you my favorite, much cliched analogy. Many of you may have heard of it. You know, what I call the Mother Teresa syndrome, which operates both in our top educational institutions and, unfortunately, I think in many companies. The Mother Teresa syndrome is very simple to me, and I refer back to, it starts with a point where I was interviewing some very bright young people from IITs and IIMs for a certain award. And I asked them this question: which among the Indians, living Indians, is your role model? And this was a few years ago. And I was in a way happy, but then on second thought dismayed to see that about 80 to 90% of them said, Dr. Kalam. I was thrilled because a former colleague and, a good friend and respected person. But this dismay came from saying, how come 80 to 90% of people give the same answer? Either they've been told this is the right answer, which is a possibility in the coaching classes, or they all think the same, which is they're clones of each other. Now, companies go through the same thing. They have these filters for selecting people. The filters are fixed. So you end up selecting probably the brightest and best and most intelligent, but those who think the same. Now, when you get people who think the same, how are you going to get innovation? Because if you talk of an innovative society, to mean the two big things about India, which are our biggest USPs vis-a-vis almost any other country, is one positive and one negative. The negative is adversity, which is unfortunate, but that's not just for those at the bottom of the pyramid. We come across it in our day-to-day lives when you're faced with a problem, and we come up with a solution. Often it's a jugaad, so to say, an improvisation, a make-do, a speeding up of the process. The other big one, which is our biggest positive, is diversity. Because when you sit right from your school classroom to college, to university, to wherever you're working, and the person next to you speaks a different language at home, looks a little different, dresses possibly a little differently, the fact that he or she thinks differently is a natural, unlike in homogeneous cultures. Are we destroying this possibility of diversity and homogeneity by our selection process, both to our best institutions and to the best companies? And long prelude to my question to you, CP, and a chance to plug your company a bit. What are you doing to encourage innovation? What have you done, and how do you take care of this problem, saying typically the Indian IT industry so far has selected clones, the brightest and the best, but all of them who think and do the same? That's a criticism that I've often levied, and how do you make sure innovation actually happens?
So Kiran, thanks for allowing me to do the commercial. So let's go back into the fundamentals of every society, every organization, every nation, and the fundamental is always about people. It's the people who created that machine, people who created that robot, people who created that Alexa. Now the question here is, obviously we don't want that cookie cutter which gives you that answer of Abdul Kalam, and we looked at that at Tech Mahindra very, very closely. We looked at what is it that keeps our organization ticking and will allow it to continue to be relevant. And I'm using this word relevant almost the third time since. If you are, then you might as well step aside. And we looked at that and we emphasized on the culture, because the culture of the organization defines the strategy, or strategy is equal to the culture. Now, if the strategy is that I want to be relevant in the technology, ever-changing technology world, then I need to make my people that important and relevant. So, within our own people, we came back with 3 tenets. We call it RISE. Number 1 was that yes, there will be challenges, yes, there will be changes, but we need to remain positive. That was number 1. Number 2 is that, you know, that old dictum, what worked yesterday is not going to continue to work tomorrow. As long as you believe in that, then the second dictum was alternate thinking. Now, we did not use the word jugaad, we did not use the word innovation, but we definitely said alternate thinking, which you may say reimagine. The third part was that don't be satisfied with what you have. And let's have some stretch goals. Now, whether those stretch goals are in terms of technology or whether it is an individual improvement, whether it is in terms of organizational improvement, whether it is in terms of customer engagement. And we believe those 3 tenets will allow us to ride the digital disruption or digital change, or accelerate the digital adoption for an individual. And if an individual is becoming more competent, we as a firm will become more competent. And I think that's what will differentiate a Tech Mahindra, that's what will differentiate all of us if we choose to actually make ourselves more sellable.
Good. So you're saying, CP, that when you look at this, and again, to put words in your mouth, when you look at the selection process and diversity, you are truly looking at diversity. And, I'll give you an example. Many people say diversity. They think diversity means gender diversity. And they try to pick young women who are just like the men they pick. And I know people actually sitting and saying, she's very good, but she's emotional, which means that's a no-no. So I don't know, is that something that you're ensuring actively in your process of recruiting people also? The culture in the company, I quite understand what you're saying, but when you recruit people, are you really looking for diversity or are you looking for more of the same?
I mean, I hope not. I mean, we definitely more of the same is not going to make any one of us great. And diversity, I think, in a lot of ways, it's just the way we work. When you work in 90 countries, when you work with 111 nationalities, I mean, and then when you encourage, a debate, when you say that you're willing to, listen to the reason, I think there is a more, and I still relate it to culture. Because if the culture is about, the command and control, the diversity doesn't mean by having different nationalities or race. But if the culture is about, having a little bit of a discussion, having a little bit of an argument, having an individual opinion, giving space to an individual, I think the diversity will automatically happen.
Very good. Yeah, I take your point and I completely agree with you on that. That's true. Shekhar, I want to get back to the point you made earlier about skills and so on. I'll ask you two questions. One is, how do you see this transition happening in India and how you're looking at what we might do in the country? And second is a much broader question. You talked of new jobs, new skills. But how do you make sure, those will also be dead in 5 years or 15 years. How do you make sure that people continue to be relevant in a 30-year career?
Just stepping back a little, I was thinking while you were talking earlier, did we, even as technology is trying to create robots which are more human, actually build humans and employees who are more like robots? And now, is it as simple as just snapping your fingers and say, stop being a robot, now become an innovator and start thinking differently? Is it going to happen? And to some extent, that question arises even in skills. I mean, somebody who has been trained in a particular way, whether it's in the educational system, where you're taught not to question anything, even the answers are all completely, reprographed. How do you change all of that? So I think that, Sri talked about the importance of incremental change. And the way I see it, I don't know if everyone would agree, but within companies, a lot of them are encouraging innovation and encouraging change. Many of them have set up incubators, accelerators, have allowed people some space and freedom. And we are seeing a lot of incremental change, incremental innovation happening within companies. But my own belief is that step change, which requires a completely different way of thinking and a complete questioning of the very basis of the earlier thought processes, actually tends to happen outside. And that's where the role of small companies and startups and entrepreneurs come, because they come with a totally new idea. And that's true in many areas. For a long time, artificial intelligence was built on logical thinking and the so-called, the system one of thinking, where people think logically. There's a large part which happens automatically, and that has a completely different way of functioning. And those approaches have produced a huge improvement, just like Satya Nadella talked about, the kind of step change which quantum computing will bring. So for each of these, I think the question again really is how the skills can be identified and how both companies within the company as well as the government and industry bodies can actually anticipate this change, because we are no longer talking about skilling people for the skills that were needed in the past or the skills that are needed today. We're saying, what are the skills that are going to be needed 5 years from now?
Can you anticipate that, Shekhar?
Well, I think that the look-ahead level, maybe for 2 or 3 years, yes, it is there. We had done a Perspective 2025 report for the industry as to what the industry would look like in 2025. And mind you, this was 10 years earlier, in 2015. So that is perhaps the limit of imagination at the current point in time. And many people felt that that actually which would come at a pace which most people felt was unlikely to happen. 2 years down the road, we find it's happened far faster than it happened. So I think directionally we do have a sense of where things are going. The pace is something which is a big unknown, and the only thing that time has shown is that whatever you think the pace will be, it's going to be faster than that.
Okay, and I see pace is faster here too. Time's running out for us, and I want to make sure we get some questions from the audience. So if three of you can request you to hold off for a moment, and some questions from the audience. I know many of you would have comments which we'd love to discuss, taking your experience into account, but may I request that given the time, just questions, please, brief questions through which we'll try to give brief answers. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Ashok from Hero MotoCorp. Actually, you talked about the barrier where people are not sort of investing. Obviously, it's not being able to see the obvious. Given your sort of wide and deep experience, why don't all of us wise men and women see that? Why is the investment not taking place? What's the true barrier? Is there a risk that is seen, or is it just inertia?
Yeah, so I think inertia is a very powerful force. I'll say there are two reasons. One is that, the ROI is not always clear, which is, it's easy for me to say that organizations should make an investment in sensitizing their employees, top to bottom, but it's not clear as to what the actual ROI is going to be. One can talk about the long-term ROI in terms of innovation coming out. It might be incremental innovation, it might be out-of-the-box innovation, whatever it might be. So I think that's one part of it. But you have to have the fortitude and you have to have the strength of conviction that the investment will actually result in something meaningful. It might help you be better prepared for the change that's going to hit you, or it might actually enable you to be more competitive going forward. So that's one. The second thing I'll say is that the truth about Indian companies, and I would say in general about India, is that people won't do something until it is absolutely necessary to do so. And I think we haven't reached that stage yet. That tsunami hasn't hit us yet. So I think just before you can see that big wave coming towards you is when I think you will see the massive change happen. That's my take on it, at least.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
This is Rajiv Asija. My question is, I think, more to CP. We heard of demographic dividend and the threat to that. Will it really, be a dividend or a disaster? So, the amount of workforce or the graduates that emerged from the colleges today, how much of them are employable? We all know that. There is a big gap there. So my question is that, is the industry doing anything specific or any tangible steps to make them more employable for the future, given the scenario that you have painted?
So, Rajiv, I don't think industry can correct the education system of this country. So, that's the first part. The second thing that I would like to add here is, Rajiv, that industry has, been very open. So, one is industry has got together under the aegis of NASSCOM. NASSCOM continuously communicates through its various councils. So, for example, the BPM Council has communicated that they don't need just the call center specialists. They now need people who can, work with various medium and also work with data. So we are not looking at just call center agents. Now, some of the private institutes, so I'll give you an example. most of the management schools have adopted to a course in entrepreneurship because they realize that is the way the employments will emerge. Most of the private institutes now have center of competencies for IoT or an analytics. But it is not true that it is there in every college. Or it is, so we can propagate it, but I don't think we can fix the education system.
Chandrashekhar, you want to just add briefly?
RC, you want to add?
Yes. Add a quick comment.
Well, I certainly agree that companies can do whatever is needed with respect to their own employees. What they can do for the educational system is certainly very limited. I think there can be no two opinions on that. But I think today we are also reaching a point where, because of the need for continuously acquiring new skills, and young people also being very aware that they need to preserve their future, and the only way to do that is new skills, companies, the choice of which company to work with is heavily influenced both by the kind of work that they do and the kind of opportunities for growth in terms of skilling that they provide. And in a sense, there is therefore a dual pressure of business needs as well as the need to keep your flock in tow, which helps keep the employee training in reasonably good fettle. And I believe, honestly, that the companies in India are doing a huge amount of work in that direction. As far as the educational system is concerned, it's a very different thing because, there's this whole debate about whether the job of, the education system is to impart knowledge or skills. And they impart the foundation and skills has to be done by somebody else. So all of these will go on, and what we have found in practice is that the skills alongside the education has a good acceptance because students do it not because it's required for the degree, but it will give them employment.
RC, you want to add the work that our NASSCOM Skill Development Council does?
Yeah.
So now as a part of this, I mean, it was a little more detail, but what we do in NASSCOM as an industry level effort is to run number of skilling programs in for certain kinds of jobs. And these programs are run alongside the curriculum in universities and in those universities, and even some of them are in schools by the member companies as well. And these programs are run on the college campuses using their facilities outside of the normal hours. And then they get a certificate, and that certificate also helps them in getting that skill recognized by the industry. And when they see a combination of a college degree and a skill certificate issued by an industry body, then all of that helps. Now, as an addition to that, we are now looking at stepping up the ante and looking at skills of the future and leveraging global content on skills in a lot of the areas that I talked about earlier, 8 technology areas and 55 kind of jobs, and imparting those skills not only to currently serving employees, but also to students and young people who want to improve their own capabilities.
Thank you, CP. Well, I'm watching this and saying what's very popular on TV. I don't know if Rajdeep is around and he can say it for me. We are completely out of time. But let me use a minute or two as a prerogative of the moderator to just sort of wind this up, not to summarize it all. I think we had a very interesting discussion. Clearly, as you saw glimpses from the 45 minutes we spent, radical changes which the new digital technologies are bringing about in health, in education, in the way we live life, and the way we interact, not only with each other, and we didn't talk of Facebook and Twitter and so on, but also the way we interact with machines, and machines interact with other machines. I think that's the big changes that are coming. Means a lot to each of us, means a lot in terms of how we do this, how we take advantage of it, the huge opportunities provided we have the right skills, right training, and the innovative abilities. Let me spend 30 seconds on closing my Mother Teresa example. You might wonder what Kalam had to do with Mother Teresa, and some of you would recall I've written about this more than once, that just like Kalam was the standard 80% answer, the prelude to that, which was in some ways many years earlier, the years when young Indian women swept the Miss Universe, Miss World, whatever contest, the final thing which had the 3 finalists were the judges asking a question. The typical question was, who was your role model? And irrespective of the question, whatever the question, role model, what do you want to be, whom do you look up to, who's your favorite person, don't listen to the question, just say Mother Teresa and you win the award. And that was the secret, of course, of saying what, in the given right answer. And I think that's important in terms of what Shekhar just ended with, the education system, not only looking at what skills are required for the future, planning for them for at least 2 years, 5 years, but I think more radical reforms. You know, we heard the finance minister today, and you heard some about the reforms, and somebody credited him with reforms. The biggest reform necessary if we are to safeguard our future is in our education system. If we don't change that, all the other reforms will be ephemeral. They'll be for a few years and we'll be back where we were. We need to radically change our education system. Change it not just to be able to answer questions, which is what the education system does today, but more importantly is for the world of tomorrow to question the answers. If that is the answer, then you should be able to ask, but why? Why not something else? Because that is what innovation is all about, and that is what has created the digital world that we see today. It's what's created the disruptions that we are seeing, some which give concerns, things like employment, things like how much is artificial intelligence going to take over our world and robots take over. And some of you would be aware that people from Elon Musk to Stephen Hawking have expressed concern about what's going to be the future and whether robots should not be more regulated in a formal sense of having something. So from that kind of world, the huge opportunities that they present for us for a better living, a better life, and something that makes inclusive development and inclusive growth possible in this country. But all this can come about if we can make sure that our organizations and our country can take full advantage of something which we're extremely well positioned to do, given our expertise and capabilities and the big market that is here. But all that will come about, as I said, if we can somehow grab this opportunity in the next few years. It's a big opening for us. It's a chance for us to catch up on what we've missed out in many centuries in the past. The basic capabilities exist. The question is, how do we leverage them? And I think that's part of what we discussed today. So I want to end by thanking our three panelists, Sri, CP, Shekhar. Thank you for sharing your insights. I'm sorry if I had to cut you in between, but as I said, we're completely out of time. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and sorry for not taking more questions. Get hold of these gentlemen on the way out if you can. Thank you.